Hello everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today for another installment of the Research Webinar Series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, as well as MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we begin today, just a quick disclaimer. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. I'll take a moment now to introduce today's presenters. Our first presenter today is John Watson, who is CEO of the Evergreen Education Group, which he founded in 2000. Evergreen is a leading consulting and advisory firm focused on K-12 education, with an emphasis on educational technology, policy research, and market intelligence. John has developed and managed Evergreen's projects with school districts, charter schools, state agencies, private schools, state virtual schools, nonprofit organizations, and content and technology companies. Evergreen clients include public schools and agencies, nonprofit organizations, and other companies. John is the lead researcher and writer for Evergreen's annual National Education Policy Report, Keeping Pace with K-12 Online and Blended Learning. Prior to founding Evergreen, John was Director of Business Development for eCollege, and prior to that position, he taught science in an outdoor school in Colorado, tutored students in Hawaii, and led students upon experiential adventures in Maine, Vermont, and Belize. In addition to education, he has worked in fisheries biology and a variety of natural resource and conservation positions. John holds a BA from Middlebury College and an MS and MBA from the University of Michigan. We also have with us Carrie Rice, who is a professor in the Department of Educational Technology at Boise State University. She is the author of Making the Move to K-12 Online Teaching, Research-Based Strategies and Practices, led the development of the Idaho K-12 Online Teaching Standards, as well as the Idaho K-12 Online Teaching Endorsement, and was a founding member and served as Vice President of the Board of Directors for Inspire Connections Academy Virtual Charter School. She is the recipient of 2 Fulbright Awards, the first a Fulbright Scholar Award to Poland in 2012-2013, and most recently a Fulbright Specialist Award to Poland for the summer of 2015. Her research focuses on best practices in K-12 online education. Lastly, we have with us Susan Lowes, who is currently Director of Research and Evaluation at the Institute for Learning Technologies at Teachers College, Columbia University. She has conducted research at both the university and K-12 levels and directed evaluations of multi-year projects funded by the U.S. Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, state and local departments of education, and private foundations. She is particularly interested in online learning and has evaluated online professional development initiatives for teachers and administrators, as well as courses and programs for students. She is also adjunct professor in the program in Computers, Communication, Technology, and Education at Teachers College, where she teaches a course on online schools and online schooling for K-12. With that, I will hand it over to our panel, and I believe John will get us started. So go ahead, John.
Thank you, Justin, and do please let me know if you're having any trouble hearing me. Justin, a couple of times when you were talking, the audio cut out, and I don't know if that cut out for me. I don't know if that is a problem on my end. If it turns out to be, and we're having any issues, please feel free to jump in and let me know. Also, I'll mention to everyone on the presentation that I'm glad to take questions throughout. I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time to get to hear what Carrie and Susan are going to talk about as well. but I'll make an effort to watch the chat window in my 15 minutes or so, and I will also, Justin, ask you if you see any questions coming in, to feel free to Joe and Susan mentioning that my voice sounds a little low. Catherine saying I sound okay. I'll keep trying to talk loud, and Justin, if I'm tailing off a little bit, then please feel free to jump in and let me know that. It's a pleasure to be on this presentation with the Michigan folks and Susan and Carrie. As Justin mentioned, I'm with the Evergreen Education Group, and contributed to the handbook the opening around a history of K-12 online and blended instruction. At Evergreen, we're now in our 15th year of tracking what's happening in online and blended learning policy. We're also in our 12th year of publishing our annual Keeping Pace report. In this presentation, I'm going to pull quite a few slides from the Keeping Pace work, and the slides and the entire report are freely available at the URL that's in the middle right of the screen, kpk12.com. I also want to mention, before getting into some of the key findings, that the report is freely available, and thank you, Catherine, for dropping the URL in the chat window. The report is freely available because of the report's sponsors. So you can see here on the screen that includes the Michigan Virtual School and a variety of other organizations. They're a mix of public agencies, for-profit companies, and nonprofit organizations, and that mix has been growing and changing in each of the last 11 years. We're especially grateful to those such as Michigan Virtual, who have been with us for so many years. In addition to financial support, they really provide tremendous help as far as the expertise that they are providing as well. I also see some people who have joined us today who are we have tapped into over the years for some work as well. So I won't mention anybody by name because it would take a while to go through everybody I see, but appreciate those of you who have helped us out over the years as well, and several people on here who are really important contributors to the field. And with that in mind, I also know that quite a few of you out there have been thinking about these issues for a while, so I encourage you to jump in and add to what I'm saying, or even better, question what I'm saying and perhaps challenge it. I want to start with a couple of observations about what we're seeing in terms of digital learning adoption rates. When we think about what the history of K-12 online and blended learning is, we tend to put it within a larger progression where the most and earliest activity comes from corporate training and the military, going back to computer-aided instruction several decades ago. We then, in the 1990s, saw a number of post-secondary institutions going online. These were especially the private proprietary schools, the University of Phoenixes, and those sorts of schools. Then within K-12, we have generally seen charter schools moving into online and blended learning a bit faster than traditional public schools, which in turn have been a bit faster than private schools, K-12 private schools. Now, I want to stress a couple of things here. One is that I'm talking about general trends. There are absolutely exceptions to all these. And secondly, these are rates that I'm talking about, not overall levels of adoption. So when I talk about, for instance, charter schools generally being faster in terms of adoption than traditional public schools, that is as a rate. We see a higher percentage of charter schools doing more with digital learning there because there's such a small percentage of overall public schools. The bulk of K-12 activity being in traditional public schools is also generating much of the digital learning activity in this space. I see Scott's comment about private schools moving slower than traditional public schools, and Chaminade in California having a cutting-edge one-to-one program. We've actually worked with Chaminade, quite familiar with them, and they are one of those that I would call among the exceptions. And Michael Barber mentioning Laurel Springs being the first K-12 online program back in the early 90s. Yeah, that's another exception, and absolutely true. But I think one of the reasons that we see private schools generally being slower overall is that they have, I would say, historically prided themselves on highly personalized learning and individualized instruction and small class sizes. Some of the very things that we see traditional public schools adopting digital learning to address, the private schools will say they've been doing without that level of technology. Now we are seeing, and I see Scott's comment on this, that a lot of Catholic schools are using blended learning to become more efficient. Absolutely true. We're seeing that. We're seeing Jewish day schools doing that as well. But I would still say that they are, as a sector, a bit slower than traditional public schools and charter schools as well. Thanks for the comments coming in so far. Appreciate the opportunity to respond in real time to some of the things that you're raising. There's also several ways in which digital learning has evolved. And I'm now going to choose to look at snapshots in 2004, which is the first year that we started working on Keeping Pace, up to 2014, which is the last year we published Keeping Pace. Back in 2004, a fair bit of activity was at the state level within state virtual schools and fully online charter schools that were attracting students from across entire states. As we fast forward to 2014, we're seeing quite a bit more activity at the school district level. And associated with that is the fact that much more activity tends to be blended in the sense of having an on-site component as well as that online component. So the evolution that we've seen going from state level and fully online to more district level and blended activity. Now, that's not to say that that there wasn't district level or school level blended activity. In earlier years, when you think about some of the credit recovery that was online and other programs, there were, I'm thinking about things like Play-Doh and other digital content that was being implemented in traditional public schools from a base of computer-based instruction. That's an important component in terms of what we see in the evolution as well. We've also seen that when you go back to 2004, as I mentioned, so much was fully online. That shift to blended started perhaps 5 or 6 years ago. In our 2014 Keeping Pace report, we have chosen to use the word digital more than online and blended. And the reason for that is there is so much activity that includes a digital component that we are using that term as opposed to the blended term, just because we're a little bit concerned that while the blended definition and the blended taxonomy has been critically important to the field, I also think that it's starting to overlook some of the digital activity that may not fit into that taxonomy. And so in some ways, we're looking a bit more broadly at what's happening within digital learning broadly. I see a couple of questions or comments here. Tom asking if I can compare and contrast the definitions of digital learning in my handbook chapter. The answer, Tom, is not offhand because I don't honestly remember what they were, but after I pass this along to Susan and Carrie, I will go look at those and comment in the chat window. And Ray mentioning state schools and increasing access, Ray, I'm going to touch on that momentarily. In fact, I'm 2 slides away from touching on that. So thank you for raising that. This is an experienced group, at least the folks that I know who are attending. So I'm only going to touch on this, but I think it's really a valuable set of characteristics or dimensions to remind ourselves about. And the reason is that these are often, although they're quite simple, they're often overlooked. There have been recent articles or reports in both NPR and The Atlantic which got some very basic aspects of K-12 digital learning wrong. And so I think for all of you who are in a position to inform policymakers and the media and others, I think thinking about these dimensions is critically important. The dimensions that you see on the screen. Is the school or program providing a full-time education for students, or is it supplemental online courses? Is it fully online, or is it blended? Is it state level, or is it district level? Not to say that this is completely encompassing. There are certainly exceptions, but in conversations with reporters, policymakers, and others who are not highly experienced and knowledgeable about this field, we find that starting with making sure that there's an understanding of these dimensions is critically important. And by the way, any school or program can be anywhere within these dimensions. They can be full-time and blended, or fully online and supplemental. And so there's really countless permutations here that we see. I want to touch on a couple of these key categories. One of these is state virtual schools. These were some of the early programs being created. As Ray Rose mentioned in the chat window, a major reason they were being created was to solve issues of equity and access because students did not have access, in particular, to AP courses, for instance. In this last year, we counted 26 states with state virtual schools, providing about 740,000 course enrollments to students across their states. Florida Virtual School is by far the largest of these, with about half of all those enrollments. There are also large programs in North Carolina, Michigan, Georgia, Alabama, and elsewhere. I see Susan's question, am I right that big charter school states do not generally have state virtual schools? I would say generally yes, but not always. There are always exceptions. We saw, especially early on, a lot of activity, particularly in the Southeast, and I think that came in particular from Florida Virtual School's early success. Want to move on to another way that states are providing supplemental online course options to their students are through course choice programs. We define these programs as those that allow students to choose an individual online course and have their public education funding follow them to the course provider of their choice. We divide these states into the states that we say have an actual program, some state-level coordination of online courses, as we see in places like Louisiana and Michigan and Wisconsin and Utah in various states of development. Other states don't really have those programs, but in fact, they are allowing students to take online courses through part-time enrollment provisions in places like Arizona and Minnesota, Kansas, and Georgia. We also look at the states with statewide fully online schools as another key category. We counted in the 13-14 school year 30 states that allowed these types of schools. You see them up on the screen here. The states in purple have few or no restrictions on these types of schools. The states in red have either geographic restrictions or restrictions on the number of schools that are allowed, or caps on the number of students that are attending these schools. We count a total of about 315,000 students in these schools. This was, again, the 13-14 school year. I noticed Scott asked a question, how valid do we think the results of the NEPC 2015 annual report? on virtual learning are. I'm actually just in the process of looking closely at that report, so I don't yet have a really comprehensive example or response to that. But I will say I noticed, and it really struck me, that report talks in the early pages about how much this sector is growing. But it's not actually growing that fast. We counted a 6% or so year-on-year growth rate, and from what's really a very small base of 315,000 students, and small relative to the larger universe of K-12 education. So it strikes me that this is a fairly small segment. For a while, it looked like it might grow more rapidly. It was growing at double-digit rates early on, but that seems to have slowed down a fair bit. Just a couple more slides that I'll try to go through fairly quickly. I appreciate all the questions, but I also don't want to take up Carrie and Susan's time. Many of those, the schools, the states in this previous slide that I showed, these fully online schools are often charter schools, although not always. We also see an important segment, which is charter schools with significant digital elements. Some of these from similar charter management organizations that are running the online schools as well, like Nexus and Flex. Others that come out of chains that were on the ground chains originally, like KIP, and yet others that have started as their own blended programs, like USC Hybrid High. We also see quite a bit of activity really growing at the district level. In the Keeping Pace report and in the handbook, we discuss differences in districts that we're seeing and what districts are doing around digital content, digital platforms, online and blended teaching, and finally the different types of devices that are being used as well. In the interest of time, I won't go into these very deeply, except to say that there is just so much activity happening that it's extremely tough to follow. Michigan, with its annual report tracking online learning, has been very valuable in terms of one component of this, which is online courses. And I think it shows just what a major undertaking it is just to do that in a single state. In the handbook, we touch on some major policies, and I'll touch on this one briefly because it's one that online learning requirements have been instituted in 5 states. This is another area where I would say 3 or 4 years ago, it seemed like there was going to be quite a bit of activity. There has not been that level of activity that we were quite expecting, and we've had this list of 5 states as the ones with these graduation requirements. It's been the same list for a number of states now. Nobody has added one recently. So in closing, as we look at the landscape in early 2015, we think about 2 things. We think about student access, and these maps, I would say, summarize access in the upper right, student access to state virtual schools in the green states, lower middle to right, student access to course choice programs in the blue and green states, left side, student access to online schools, fully online schools in the purple and red states. You can see lots of white states, which means that there are still lots of places where students' access is at least in part determined by their zip code. And I would say that what's happening with student outcomes is a second area that's really critically important. Referencing that NEPC report, we know that NEPC has done quite a bit of shining a spotlight on what's happening with those fully online schools. There are these other categories which are not nearly as well studied, and I'd say particularly the digital learning activity at the district level. It's a hugely important area for research going forward. With that, I am going to turn it over to Carrie Rice, and while I'm doing that, I'll scroll back through the questions and comment on any within the chat. Carrie, on to you.
Thank you so much, John. Can somebody confirm that you can hear me? so I'm not talking into the void. Thank you so much. Yeah, great, thanks. So let me first just say that I am so grateful for the invitation to present today, especially with my highly esteemed colleagues, John and Susan. I am a professor in the Department of Educational Technology, and just to give you a brief overview of what we do, we're an online graduate program focused on, well, ed tech and primarily emerging technologies in education, and my primary focus is evaluating best practices in online education. I do a lot of online teacher preparation. I don't know if you're aware, but we do have in Idaho, we have a K-12 online teaching endorsement. It's a voluntary endorsement, but we're working through processes now and getting teachers endorsed, primarily teachers that are actually out there teaching online. And we've developed a competency-based framework for that that's working out quite well. So that's been pretty exciting in our state. So to get started, I was charged with writing the chapter on policy in terms of, or its impact on K-12 online and blended learning. So the chapter is really historical kind of analysis of U.S. education policy with a focus on the most recent policy developments, key trends, and issues. It was challenging to write because, you know, in essence, every educational policy is going to have some kind of impact on online and especially blended, because blended is a more mainstream approach. But I did manage to find some common themes, and I'll share some of that with you during this presentation. And my plan today is just to provide the briefest overview of the chapter and kind of look forward to what's happening currently. So we can't really have any discussion about policy without discussing the factors that influence policy in general. So obviously the political climate has an impact on what happens or doesn't happen in terms of policy, and it kind of seems like we're in the worst time in history for any policy discussion, given the political climate, you know, our budget worries, the influx of private interest in education, which has certainly been a driver in online education, especially in online, fully online, advancements in technology, and our embedded ideas about what school is, and that came up a little bit in John's presentation as well. So understanding our new definitions of school. So where have we been? And this is kind of the process the chapter takes. So it talks about where we've been in terms of historical policy. And all of our policies are impacted by our ideas about social and cultural norms. And the primary force from the very beginning in policy has always been this competing tension between our belief in local control, our belief that students are best served when decisions are made at the local level, versus this idea of federal mandates that are tied to funding, and not necessarily federal legislation, but federal mandates. And understanding these tensions becomes critical in understanding funding mechanisms and requirements of states and that sort of thing. So even though there isn't policy at the federal level, what happens is they affect state policy. And also what's coming into play recently is the change in the traditional roles of state agencies, state education agencies, state superintendents, and even state governments. So that's part of these competing tensions. The purpose of education has always been a driver in policy. So we've had, you know, a purpose in developing good citizenship, personal growth, global competitiveness, content area skills, critical thinking, workforce training and development, and so on. So purposes have a huge impact on policy development. And some examples of that, and I think this is quite interesting. In 1958, the National Defense Act actually provided support for schools across the country nationally in science, math, and foreign language. And as recently as 2012, there were policy recommendations from a U.S. Education Reform and National Security Report prepared by a task force of the Council on Foreign Relations, highlighting threats to our economic growth, our global competitiveness, our physical safety, our intellectual property, and even our unity as a nation. And this is initially where, well, they supported recommendations for common standards and national assessments to alleviate those threats. So I keep bringing up this idea of culture in the policy because it relates so critically to our understanding of what school is. And we kind of have an embedded notion in our minds of school as an industrial model. And we keep trying to rely on this common definition when in reality it doesn't exist anymore. So how can you legislate policy when there's not a common understanding of the principal focus you're legislating for? And it's just one of the additional challenges that we face in policy decisions. Equality is another historical element in policy. Equality in terms of discrimination practices or eliminating discrimination practices. So, you know, we're all familiar with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 and Brown versus the Board of Education, which eventually led to the enactment of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the ESEA, which is becoming very important currently because it has been reauthorized many times, and our current model is No Child Left Behind. So this was a comprehensive effort to address problems of inequality and quality of educational opportunities at a national level, and includes things like Title I programs and support for students with special needs. And then international competitiveness starts to enter the scene in the Nation at Risk report in 1983, and then equity more recently in terms of infrastructure and access to quality educational experiences in 1994 with the reauthorization of ESEA and the Educate America Act. And also in 1994 we start to see the addition of school choice options, which is critical to online learning and especially charter schools. So it actually allowed the proliferation of online charter schools. I'm trying to read as I'm going. Let's see. We're talking about definitions. Yes. Okay. And then finally accountability, which is on the horizon recently, most recently, with the Common Core standards and Common Core assessments. So those are kind of where we've been. And now I'll talk just a little bit about where we are now. And I'm not going to go over all of the different policies exactly, just look at the kind of themes that I created or categories that I've kind of placed policy development in. And I just want you to have the understanding that these are not static categories. They're fluid and dynamic, and one area can cross over into another. So it was really challenging to create general themes. Competency-based learning, for example, could fit under accountability as well as innovation and reform. So it was just a way for me to create this framework so I could better understand and hopefully convey the big picture of policy in the United States and its impact on K-12 online and blended learning. So where we are now talks about policies starting about the beginning of the 21st century, give or take a couple of years. So we see our first online schools developed in, 1991 with the Laurel Springs School, but in a major way with the Florida Virtual School in 1997. And during this time, in the early 21st century, there are many kind of policy recommendations that are being developed, and they're all outlined in the chapter. But policy recommendations for improved access to the internet, for equitable distribution of e-learning opportunities, for technology-rich learning environments, and we see those in ed tech plans and policies from other organizations as well. We also have national kind of funding initiatives beginning at this time, and E-rate is just one example of that. That's had a huge influence on not necessarily national policy, but state level policy. So accountability includes all of those things. Well, the national standards, which are anything that's fueling consistent inputs. So No Child Left Behind, obviously, is included there. And then also increased accountability and transparency through data. So we see this movement to outcome and performance. And this brings with it also student privacy and student data privacy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Access includes things like equity, competition, so school choice legislation, and there is federal legislation for that, but it's just guidelines, and states vary greatly in their school choice legislation on whether they allow charter schools or not, and how they're allowed. And then also more recently is course choice options. So this has actually had a fairly devastating effect on supplemental programs when it's allowed to go through. And there are a couple, let's see, a couple things I didn't include on my slide. One is privatization and competition, and then global competitiveness policies are also included in this category. And when we look at global competitiveness, there's a lot of activity under college preparedness, and we'll also see that in the newer ESEA reauthorization proposals. Innovation and reform, so this idea of improving efficiency and scalability in programs, which is really supportive to online and blended programs. Next generation learning grants are an example of this. What is school? This idea of what defining school, and that's kind of been left up to the states. So that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. So states may define their schools differently. And then I see Joe's asked a question about the devastating effects about course choice. So, and this has happened in Idaho, where our supplemental program received funding from the legislature to operate, and competitors have come in and asked the state to allow other entities to offer supplemental online courses to districts and students. And so what almost happened was the funding for our supplemental program was taken away, and students would have to pay for that, but that was all rescinded when when the legislation that rule was contained in was revoked. So it's happened in Florida though as well. And so maybe somebody else can add to that. Where was I? Okay, what is school? Funding models that are being reevaluated in different states. So states have alternate funding models, and part of that is tied to course choice as well. And then competency-based learning, which has kind of been a grassroots effort up until very recently. So there are a few states that have competency-based options for schools and programs and students. New Hampshire is one of those, but it's actually hit the national landscape in the new proposal for ESEA reauthorization. And then we finally have teacher and administrator preparation, which always seems to be the last thing on anyone's mind, in my mind anyway. So we've seen standards development by organizations in some states. So Idaho actually has a set of K-12 online teaching standards. And we see very little in terms of administrator preparation, guidelines or recommendations or legislation in online and K-12 online. So that's just a general overview. Let me see what my time looks like. Okay, I'm going to get moving faster. So we do obviously have some challenges. Some of those, this is not all, are flexibility in attendance reporting, so this idea of seat time versus outcomes, funding formulas, student-to-teacher ratios, versus measuring instructional time per student. So many states have regulations or legislation indicating how the student-to-teacher ratios, which is a barrier to innovative types of programs. Competency-based learning barriers include place-based assessments, proficiency equated to grade level, relying on GPA rather than mastery, those kinds of things. Teacher and administrator preparedness are challenges still. Very few institutions of higher education include any kind of online instruction or training for teachers still. And reciprocal teaching licensure agreements, that's a whole nother issue for online schools. And then, of course, overcoming our embedded ideas about what school is. Yeah, that's how I feel when I'm trying to implement something new. So the end of the chapter actually provides some recommendations for transformation through policy, and these are not necessarily my recommendations. They're recommendations that I've gleaned through the research that I did. So instituting transparent, consistent accountability measures, and that helps online because there's this idea that we can share best practice. It's so much easier to share best practices when we have transparent and consistent accountability measures. Putting student learning first, valuing innovative and alternative educational delivery methods, and then preparing teachers and administrators for a digital age. And so in the next little section, what I did was I thought I would pull together some of the latest activity that I've been able to find relating to those 4 recommendations. So in terms of accountability, we've seen a lot of activity in the ESEA reauthorization. And I'm going to post a link here. I created a Google document. Let me see if I got the whole link in there, yeah. With links to all of the links I have in my slides, because I realize you probably can't get to those. So back in 2010, the current administration created a blueprint for reform. So it was a proposal for the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, and it kind of just sat there. And then all of a sudden in 2014, 2015, we started to see a little activity going on. So January 9th, this is the Chief State Officers, and I don't have the actual name for the acronym, CCSSO. Basically, these are the state superintendents across the country, outline their priorities for the reauthorization. Secretary Duncan posted his vision for the reauthorization. January 14th, Chairman Alexander announced his plan to fix No Child Left Behind, and he called it the Student Success Act. On the 16th, Secretary Duncan posted an opinion piece kind of lambasting the GOP's version of the reauthorization. On the 20th, we were pretty optimistic that something would happen. On the 11th, February 11th, the House passed the rewrite of the No Child Left Behind reauthorization. On the 25th, the White House threatened to veto it. On the 27th, they pulled the reauthorization from the floor because they didn't have support, and now we're back to it's not looking so good. So there actually is a new bipartisan committee that's been created to work on the plan. So we'll see if that gets us anywhere. And the primary arguments are over those competing interests. So the federal control versus local control. So it's over accountability and it's over teacher preparation as well. In terms of accountability, it's allowing, the GOP is recommending allowing states to develop their own standards and assessments, where the Obama administration is still fighting to keep national standards and assessments. So that's kind of where we are. Thank you, Ray, for that. Council of Chief State School Officers. And it looks like I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly. Big data and student privacy. We've had a lot of incidents surrounding this idea. Connect EDU went bankrupt and sold their company as well as all of the student data files. So there's no real guidance or guidelines on what to do with student data when something like that happens. Google is under a lawsuit right now for using student Gmails and data mining student Gmails for advertising. Just recently there was a post about Pearson spying on students' social media accounts during testing. And in response to this, the federal government has done some things. So they've created a privacy technical assistance center that offers guidance and help. They wrote a White House Big Data report, which has some interesting things in terms of education. And they actually created a model terms of service for data privacy document that schools and districts can use to help them figure out how to manage student data and still abide by FERPA laws. And then funding, I'll keep those links. I've got to hurry up quickly. Innovation, so 5 predictions for innovation, teacher and administrator prep. And I do want to mention, I did not put here on the link the slide to the Keeping Pace report on this. And so they have actually a really good report on where we are right now and reciprocal licensing across the country, and I've included it on the Google document. And then finally, state level reforms. In case you want to keep up with state level reforms, there is a federal website at IES that keeps track of state legislation that you can follow. And with that, I'm so sorry I had to end so quickly. I will hand it over to Susan.
Okay, thank you. How do
I'll do it for you there.
Okay, so my chapter in the book, I assume you can hear me, everybody can hear me. My chapter in this book looks at overall approaches to research and specific research methods, and it cites examples. It's by no means comprehensive. A lot of the people that are cited are actually on this webinar right now, and tries to look at the evolution over time. What I'm going to do here is not even go through the individual sites, but sort of pull out the themes. It was difficult to find an interesting way to present this, so I spent a couple of hours looking online for cartoons and things so that I could at least liven it up a little bit. So the very first stuff that we saw was focused mostly on best practices. There was a good reason for that. We really didn't know anything about what was a good practice. It was a whole new area, very little prior literature. So we had to know what was going on in order to ask really researchable questions. And we also began to see a lot of practitioner-related guidelines, reports, INACOL's promising practices. I think a lot of us on here wrote some of these. And there were also a number of evaluations, but evaluations tend to focus on the projects and often don't get published. So we didn't build on that work to the extent to which we might have. The first large body of research was comparing face-to-face. Just one step back a moment. There were a couple of large collections, What Works, that Kathy Cavanaugh and Bob Blomeyer did, What Works in K-12 Online Learning, and Fertig and Cavanaugh, Lessons Learned, all practitioner stories. First big body was face-to-face online, the first really big issue that was addressed. It was driven a lot by policy considerations, by the need to show that online was just as good as face-to-face. So there were these early meta-analyses, but there wasn't much to build them on. They tended to be built off higher education. It turned out to be really difficult to compare online and face-to-face because the online groups were often self-selected. The online groups had very high attrition, big selection bias. And then we gradually began to think, well, we shouldn't really be comparing these. We should be looking at the differences between them and trying to understand the online environment and where was it strong, where was it weak, and how could we make it better. But I have to say that reading for journals and so on, I still see tons of things that are trying to compare online and face-to-face. Most of the early research was case studies, as it should be, because we still didn't know very much. Case studies provide the kind of background and the insights that we need to build on future research. And you can have a case study of a group, of a classroom, of individuals. Case studies can use almost any data collection method. So there were, as case studies, there were surveys of teachers, of students, and administrators. And I think some of the people on this webinar wrote some of these case studies. The surveys were done to learn about online teachers and online students. So teachers were surveyed because we didn't know what was bringing them to online learning, what their backgrounds were, what their experiences were, what their preferences were, what did they like about training, Carrie did some of this, professional development. Students were surveyed in terms of their satisfaction in particular. Administrators were surveyed to learn about how they were supporting their online teachers. The problem with all of these was that the response rates were really low, which made it really difficult to generalize from the results. At the same time, we began to have interviews. You really need interviews to know who it is you're talking to. The interviews provided the kind of information you can't get from surveys, the kind of information that you can get from actually talking to people. But interviewing is very time intensive, so the numbers were small. It was often dissertation research. The sampling was strategic. So we had Meredith's interviews of successful teachers. We had interviews with selected schools about PD. We had interviews with school administrators. We had interviews with mentors. All of that still to get a much more nuanced understanding of what was going on out there. We also had some ethnographic studies. Ethnographic studies are attempts to get inside the heads or the social environments of those being studied. So from the participant's perspective, they can provide a richness of detail that you can't get in other ways. But they are difficult in a virtual environment. You have to sort of rethink what the field is. So there have been a couple of studies of how students spend their time when working on their online courses, at least one using video observations. And there's been one study that I know of teachers teaching also using video observation, webcam, and home visits. 2 studies, I think, about those. So they're difficult, but they give us a whole different perspective on what's happening in these courses. There is content analysis. This is example actually comes from one of my own classes where I have my students read the websites for private for-profit and the websites for state virtual schools, and then turn the words that they find into a Wordle. A Wordle is a very, very graphic form of content analysis. So content analysis is used has been used at all kinds of different levels of sophistication. Most interview studies use some kind of content analysis to draw out themes. Surveys use content analysis to analyze the open-ended responses. There's some of that. Studies of in-course interactions have used content analysis of discussion forum text to look at the quality, nature, and evolution of different kinds of interaction. And studies of wikis have used content analysis for the same thing. And there are examples of all of these in the chapter itself. Content analysis is hugely time-consuming, so tends, again, to be dissertation-level work. And then more recently, we've begun to see some learning analytics. And it's sort of how some of us feel this cartoon. Online courses generate massive amounts of back-end data. So actually very early, people started looking at clicks and hits, but was not very sophisticated. And now it's become much more sophisticated. Looking often to find metrics that will alert practitioners to students who need additional support, or to look at who's succeeding and who's failing and how can you use these kind of analytics to do some prediction. Lots of statistical analysis, some statistical modeling. And I think the bottom line, I think Joe's done some of this too, is this is not easy, this is not simple, it's not very easy to interpret. Carrie's done some of it too, actually. We used a lot of hers. Not as simple as you might think it might be, or you might hope it might be. It gets quite complicated. So what's next? There's been a literal explosion of research, particularly dissertation research, and the kind of work that MVLRI is supporting, and also a few providers. So we are going to see a huge amount, I think, in the next few years. We're going to see not so many broad surveys anymore, more in-depth case studies, more studies relating to specific participants, mentors, parents, like some of the people on this webinar are doing. More studies of what works in terms of instructional design. More controlled studies where you alter conditions from within one course or one school to try to tease out some of the important things we now need to learn. More studies across schools, and I suspect a lot more data analytics. I think Scott has a question about statistical modeling techniques, SEM, all kinds of different decision. Yeah, Carrie did decision tree, clustering, pattern recognition. We've done some SEM, some other kinds of modeling, HLM, and so on. It's getting more and more sophisticated, but still a difficult area, fascinating, difficult. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Susan. I'll leave this last slide up here for a few more minutes. If anyone, a few more seconds, I should say. If anyone has some questions that they'd like to pose to Susan or any of our presenters, please feel free to do so. In the meantime, I'd like to just post a quick poll about today's webinar specifically. So if you could go ahead and vote in 2 quick polls that I'll post here. Hopefully the polls themselves aren't too complicated. I think you'll see that they're pretty simple in nature. But yep, so we're just trying to get a few measurements on some satisfaction things. And yes, presenters do get to vote. Thank you. Your feedback might be the most important out of everyone's. And in addition to that, we do have our quarterly satisfaction survey, which is actually much more broad, not just in the scope of today's webinar, but also in the scope of all of the initiatives that we've been doing here at the Institute. So if you have already gotten this, you may have already received this through email from us. But if not, please take a minute to click that link there, and I'll also post the URL in the chat window. Please take a minute, it's 5 minutes I should say, to answer a few questions about the initiatives that we've been doing with MVLRI so we can get a better feel for how we are serving the research community at large and what we can do to improve as well. I see Scott's question about some discussion posts to analyze. I'm hoping some of our presenters or some of our experts in attendance here can help him out with that question. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention a few other things. MVLRI has been asked to host an online and blended learning research community meeting, which would be a pre-conference workshop before the INACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium, which we will hold November 8th, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. So if you're interested in helping shape how that meeting will look, how it will go, if you have some ideas that you'd like to present on or hear about, please reach out to us. I'll be sharing our contact information in just a few slides here. We also want to point you to two of our ongoing initiatives, our Virtual Viewpoints podcast, where we sit down with folks who are actually practitioners, policymakers, administrators, anyone within the realm of K-12 public ed or private ed who are working with online and blended learning and how they're applying research in the field to their actual practice, as well as our guest blogger program, where we are having folks share to our audience some of the work that they've been working on. So if you have an interest in writing for us or possibly being a guest on the podcast, or you just simply like to see what we've already published and put out there, click on either of those two links within the slides to take a look at what we've put together thus far. We do want to advertise next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be hosting a webinar with Jared Borup from George Mason, who I believe is in attendance today, and our own Rebecca Stimson from MVLRI, where we'll be examining some of Michigan's different mentor models, so mentoring online learning and how those programs look within the state of Michigan. We also want to promote that we will be at McCall this starting tomorrow, actually. We have a number of presentations, so that link there is a link to all of the presentations that Michigan Virtual University will be giving at McCall, which is a Michigan-centered conference on educational technology. So if you'd like to check us out, please come see our booth or come to some of our conference sessions if you are in attendance. And lastly, if you'd like to offer us any feedback for any of our initiatives, please feel free to reach out to us at mvlri@mivu.org. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handles are listed there, as well as our LinkedIn page, our YouTube channel where we host the recordings of our webinars, and our webinars page, which will actually show you all of our archived webinars as well as a list of our upcoming scheduled webinars. I want to extend a huge thank you to our presenters once again. A great breadth of topics there. You guys really touched on a lot of great things over a lot of years in the research in K-12 online and blended. We want to thank all of our attendees for coming as well today. We hope that you found something valuable in today's session, and if there is anything else you'd like to share, please do so in the chat window, and we hope to hear from you or see you next Wednesday at next Wednesday's webinar. So in the meantime, take care and have a great week, everyone.